Inside the heart are 4 chambers or spaces for blood to go. 2 smaller upper chambers, one here and then one tucked behind that vessel. The 2 smaller upper chambers are called atria, and the 2 lower, larger chambers are called ventricles. These larger chambers are what actually propel the blood forward. Blood flows from the atria down into the ventricles. There are valves that control the direction of blood flow through the heart so that blood can only move forward. There are 2 atria, one on the right side which receives deoxygenated blood from the body. The left atrium receives freshly oxygenated blood from the lungs. In the upper region of the heart, the 2 atria are next to each other and divided by the interatrial septum. The inside of the atria is smooth on the posterior surface, but the anterior region, which is not seen here, and in the auricles, it has a comb-like pattern of parallel ridges called musculi pectinati. The word comes from pectin, meaning comb. The purpose of the atria is first to allow blood to go through into the ventricles. When the contraction phase begins, it starts with both atria here contracting first, pushing any last little bit of blood into the ventricles to top them off. In elderly hearts, the amount of blood that the atrial contraction adds to the ventricular filling becomes much more significant, so that anything that may compromise the action of the atria is not that problematic in young, healthy people, but in elderly individuals, it could reduce the amount of blood being filled by the ventricles and therefore minimize ejection. The right atrium is the first place that blood returning to the heart from the body arrives at. The superior vena cava brings blood from the head and upper body to the right atrium. The inferior vena cava brings blood from the lower body to the right atrium. The blood that arrives at the right atrium is deoxygenated or used up blood. In addition to the superior and the inferior vena cava bringing blood from the body to the right atrium, there is also a hole where the coronary sinus drains into, which contains the used up blood from the heart itself. Another unique feature found inside the right atrium is called the fossa ovalis. The fossa ovalis is a circular indentation on the interatrial septum. In a fetus, this is the location of an actual hole called the foramen ovale, meaning oval hole, where blood would go through to bypass the right ventricle and lungs and go directly to the left atrium. At birth, a flap then covers this hole and seals it up. What remains is a slight indentation that we see as the fossa ovalis. The left atrium is the first place that blood returning from the lungs enters the heart. There are 4 pulmonary veins that create holes in the left atrium for the freshly oxygenated blood to enter, 2 from each lung. This oxygenated blood is now ready to be sent down into the left ventricle, which will then allow it to be ejected and distributed throughout the body. There are 2 ventricles. The right ventricle ejects deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary circulation going to the lungs. The left ventricle ejects oxygenated blood out to the body through the systemic circulation. The myocardium in the free wall of the left heart is much thicker than the free wall on the right side of the heart. This is due to the higher pressures required by the left ventricle to squeeze blood and push the blood throughout the entire systemic circulation compared to the amount of energy needed for the right ventricle to squeeze the blood out into the lungs. The inside of the ventricles has a muscular pattern that crisscrosses like a mesh or net. This is called trabeculae carneae. The whole purpose of the heart is to provide the energy to the blood to propel it forward and to keep the circulation moving. This is the primary function of the ventricles in the heart. The heart ejects simultaneously blood out to the lungs via the pulmonary artery and out to the whole body via the aorta. The right ventricle receives the body's deoxygenated blood from the right atrium. It collects and fills until the heart begins the next contraction cycle or beat. When the heart contracts, the right ventricle ejects blood out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs. The features that can be viewed when you look inside the right ventricle is first the myocardium on the free wall is much thinner than compared to the left side. The right atrioventricular valve, more commonly known as a tricuspid valve, has strings to keep it in place called chordae tendineae, which are attached to cone-shaped myocardium pieces called papillary muscles. The pulmonary semilunar valve can also be seen in the outflow tract of the right ventricle. The left ventricle receives the lungs' oxygenated blood from the left atrium. It collects and fills until the heart begins the next contraction cycle or beat. When the heart contracts, the left ventricle ejects blood out to the body via the aorta. This takes a considerable amount of force, so the heart wall on the left side is much thicker than the heart wall on the right. In people with high blood pressure, the heart wall on the left side has to get even thicker, and which may often compromise the inner chamber size and therefore filling. Inside the left ventricle, you can see the left atrioventricular valve, commonly known as the mitral valve. Like the tricuspid valve, it has strings to keep it in place called chordae tendineae, which are attached to papillary muscles. The aortic semilunar valve can be seen in the outflow tract from the left ventricle. Regulating the direction of blood flow through the heart are valves. There are a total of 4 valves inside the heart. The valves function using the pressure changes within the heart during a contraction-relaxation cycle. Atrioventricular valves are just that. They are located between the atria and the ventricles. There are 2 of them. There is one on the right side between the right atrium and right ventricle, and there is one on the left side between the left atrium and the left ventricle. These valves let blood into the ventricles, but prevent blood from going back that way when the ventricle is squeezing tightly during the contraction phase. The other 2 valves are semilunar valves. We only see one in this image. These valves have very different features, and they are located at the base of both major arteries leaving the heart. The pulmonary semilunar valve allows blood to exit the right ventricle when the heart is ejecting, but prevents blood from going back into the right ventricle during the relaxation phase. The aortic semilunar valve allows blood to exit the left ventricle during ejection and prevents backflow during relaxation. Atrioventricular valves are found on the inside of the ventricles. They have large triangular flaps with strings called chordae tendineae, which are attached to papillary muscles inside the ventricles. These valves allow blood to enter the ventricles. Then, when the ventricles contract and build pressure, the blood then billows up, squeezing these valves tightly together. The chordae tendineae attach to the papillary muscles, hold the valves in so they don't invert and let blood go back into the atria. The right atrioventricular valve is made of 3 flaps, which is why it's primarily called the tricuspid valve. The left atrioventricular valve is made of 2 larger flaps. It is commonly called the mitral valve and may also be called the bicuspid valve. Semilunar valves are found in the outflow tracts of each ventricle located at the entrance to the artery outlet from the heart. There are 3 thin and strong cusps that make up these valves. The valves open easily when the ventricle ejects blood out to the arteries, pushing these cusps up and to the side. Then when the pressure in the ventricles decline, the blood slows down and actually reverses and catches in these cups. The more blood is caught in here, the tighter this seals. Here we can see the aortic valve opening and closing. See how thin and delicate each of the cusps are? And then they seal tightly together when the pressure in the ventricle below lowers. You can find this video at the link listed. The pulmonary semilunar valve allows blood being ejected by the right ventricle to go out to the pulmonary trunk and then out to the lungs. As the right ventricle relaxes, the drop in pressure causes the blood in this region to come back and fill these cusps to seal this valve shut so that no blood will go backward into the ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve allows the blood to leave the left ventricle as it is ejected from the heart and out to the body. During ventricular relaxation, the valve shuts by the weight of the blood as it fills the cusps. When you listen to your heart with a stethoscope, you should hear a double thump. Instead of thump, 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 you should feel the heart go lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. The sounds you hear are the valve shutting like slamming a door. The movement of blood should be silent. In a normal heart, you should only hear valves close. Murmurs in a heart can be detected when you hear swishing. To listen to examples of heart sounds, go to the Auscultation Assistant website. The first heart sound that you hear is from the right and left atrioventricular valves closing simultaneously. The second heart sound, or the dub portion, is the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves simultaneously closing. Because of the position of the heart within the rib cage, you have to be careful about where you place the stethoscope to hear specific valves. Position the stethoscope up high in the second intercostal space to hear the semilunar valves. On the right side, you can hear the aortic semilunar valve, as this is best positioned near the aortic arch. On the left side, you can hear the pulmonary semilunar valve. This may seem backward, but you have to consider the anatomical position of the pulmonary trunk and the aorta for this to make sense. The tricuspid valve can be heard on the left side of the sternum in the fourth or fifth intercostal space. In the fifth intercostal space along the mid-clavicular line, you can hear the mitral valve. Blood enters the atria. Deoxygenated blood enters the right atrium, and freshly oxygenated blood enters the left atrium and flow down into the ventricles. As the ventricles fill with blood, the contraction cycle begins with the contraction of the atria pushing any last bit of blood into the ventricle. The ventricles begin to contract, squeezing the blood inside. This first closes the atrioventricular valves, and you can hear the lub portion of the heart sounds. The ventricles continue to squeeze with blood going nowhere until enough pressure has developed inside to open up the semilunar valves. This is an important point because the pressure that it takes for the ventricle, particularly the left ventricle, to open that aortic semilunar valve is the lower number or diastolic number that you get on your blood pressure reading. So if somebody has a blood pressure of 120/80, the left ventricle has to develop 80 just to open that aortic valve and send blood out. Once the pressure in the arteries have been achieved, blood can exit the ventricles as the ventricles continue to contract and propel the bolus of blood that was in each ventricle forward. Note that the ejection from the left and right sides of the heart occur simultaneously.